Do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law. Hyperabyssic Ontology, Part 11, the lower psychological triad. I will treat Netsock and Hode together based on the standard, if a bit shop-worn, right-left brain opposition between the emotions and the intellect. These concepts are not well served by treating emotion as immediate and analysis as abstract. For feelings can be very elaborately developed and reflected upon, just as the operations of conceptual thought can arrive intuitively as a flash of insight. Instead, I view feeling and reason as modalities of psychic activity which dynamically interpenetrate each other in mutual interaction. The restless oscillation of experience between these twin modes of conscious thought and their creative contradictions result in the alchemical precipitation of the self-consciousness represented by Tiferet. Netsock corresponds to Venus, the goddess of love, while Hode is assigned to Mercury, the god of writing, medicine, and the sciences. In Aleister Crowley's system of magical training, the study of Kabbalistic doctrine is assigned to the grade work of the practicus in Hode, while the devotional exercises of Bhakti Yoga are the concern of the philosophus in Netsock. These correspondences might seem to imply the traditional and also patriarchal symbolism that reason is masculine and emotion feminine. However, here as elsewhere on the Tree of Life, gendered symbolism is ambiguous and polyvalent. For example, the Golden Dawn's association of fire to Netsock and water to Hode can be read as indicating the opposite attributions. The interpretation of these Sephiroth in terms of gender essentialism, where emotionality is regarded as a specifically female trait in distinction from male intellection, is undermined by the countercharging of gender symbolism between the Sephiroth. Gender is a social construction that lacks an abiding fixed essence and elides unambiguous inscription onto the Tree of Life, as the permutations of its hermeneutical possibilities exceed and escape the boundaries demarcated by the phallic symbolic order, which is itself an inherently incomplete structural totality, incapable of being closed and completed. If the self-consciousness of Tiferet is the result of the interplay of Netsock and Hode, then Yesod stands for the medium of psychic representation as such. It refers to the faculty of the imagination, not to be confused with the structural category of the imaginary, upon whose stage the various movements of the Ruach make their appearance. It is the image-making function of the mind, such that we can see our thoughts through an inner reverie alongside the representations built up from the external senses, which are also visible to us in and through the functioning of the imagination. In his famous Theory of the Imagination, Samuel Taylor Coleridge designates three aspects of the phenomenon. He writes, quote, "The imagination I then first consider either as primary or secondary. The primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. The secondary I consider as an echo of the former, coexisting with the conscious will, yet still as identical with the primary in the kind of its agency, and differing only in degree and in the mode of its operation. It dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to recreate. Or, where this process is rendered impossible, yet still at all events it struggles to idealize and to unify. It is essentially vital, even as all objects, are essentially fixed and dead. Secondly, fancy, on the contrary, has no other counters to play with but fixities and definites. The fancy is indeed no other than a mode of memory emancipated from the order of time and space, and blended with and modified by that empirical phenomenon of the will, which we express by the word choice. But equally, with the ordinary memory, it must receive all its materials ready-made from the law of association," unquote. That's taken from Biographia Literaria. In this passage, Coleridge defines three kinds of imagination: the primary imagination, the secondary imagination, and the fancy. I will refer to these as the transcendental imagination, the creative or synthetic imagination, and the automatic imagination, respectively. They all relate in different ways to the mind's ability to produce noetic images apart from immediate sensory perception. These include picture images as well as all the other types of mental content that can occur to abstract thought. My use of the term transcendental imagination derives from the first edition of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, where it designates the overarching formal structuring or transcendental horizon of the human understanding such that coherent mental experience is possible. Kant writes, quote, "The synthesis of imagination is grounded, antecedently to all experience, upon a priori principles. We must assume a pure transcendental synthesis of imagination as conditioning the very possibility of all experience. We shall therefore entitle this faculty the transcendental faculty of imagination." Unquote. In Kabbalistic symbolism, Yesod is located along the middle pillar between Malkut, the world of phenomenal appearances, and Tifereth, corresponding to self-consciousness. Likewise, in Kant's transcendental psychology, it is the imagination that mediates between the synthetic unity of apperception that unifies the understanding or sense of subjective interiority with the intuitions of the sensibility. Kant writes, quote, "A pure or transcendental imagination, which conditions all a priori knowledge, is thus one of the fundamental faculties of the human soul. By its means we bring the manifold of sensory intuition on the one side into connection with the condition of the necessary unity of pure apperception on the other. The two extremes, namely sensibility and understanding, must stand in necessary connection with each other through the mediation of this transcendental function of imagination." Unquote. In Being and Time, Martin Heidegger reinterprets Kant's transcendental imagination in terms of the hermeneutical horizon of being, which serves an analogous function in his existential analytic of human existence, in the sense that it provides the phenomenological foundation for the clearing, or Lichtung, of the space of world intelligibility, within which human beings live, move, and have their being. Heidegger differs from Kant in that he is keen to criticize the Cartesian interiority of Kant's transcendental categories. Rather, for Heidegger, the horizon of being cannot be located either inside or outside the phenomenon of either the mind or the external world. The ontology of being is primordially anterior to both these phenomenal domains. Therefore, although Heidegger is intent on thinking human existence historically, his methodology results in his historicism having a virtual quality. I think there is something correct about this approach. However, it is also limited because it means that Heidegger, like Kant, is unable to provide an explanation for why the transcendental imagination has historically come to have the structure that it has. The social normativity established and undergirded by the transcendental imagination becomes mystified. And I think this does contribute to Heidegger's political conservatism and the rather serious issues that emerge from this orientation. I think that an answer to the political problematic of the form of the transcendental imagination lies with Lacan's reading of Freud, which incorporates and builds on the work of Kant and Heidegger alongside other continental philosophical figures. By further identifying the transcendental imagination with Lacan's imaginary, it becomes possible to thematize the social material basis for its structuring in terms of language and of the historical contingency of the symbolic order, while at the same time avoiding the kind of reductive materialism that Heidegger is correct to criticize in his existential analytic. The solution lies in the recognition that while the horizon of being founds human historicity, being is itself also historical. Heidegger partially grasps this in his turning, or Kara, of his later thought after the writing of Being and Time, where he begins to think being in terms of an event or a ripeness that gathers and appropriates beings to itself. Unfortunately, as the recent publication of his so-called Black Notebooks have made increasingly clear to students of his work, Heidegger's event coincides with the fascist revolution in Germany, and this deeply, although by no means completely, compromises whatever insights arise from Heidegger's later philosophy. Again, I think the best approach to constructive use of Heidegger's philosophy in the present context is to read him through the lens of the French left's interpretation of his writings, particularly that of Lacan. Although the psychological faculty of the imagination corresponding to Yesod is not simply the same as the imaginary, more directly symbolized by Bina, there is nevertheless a close relationship between the two psychological functions, related to Coleridge's distinction between the primary and secondary aspects of the imagination. One way to put this relationship would be to say that the forms of the imaginary are reflected into the content of the imagination. The imaginary constitutes the unconscious system of signifiers whose social usages the subject has learned from their socialization within the symbolic order. The imaginary semiotically structures the conditions of the possibility for the images produced by the imagination, which can appear only in and through the linguistic framework provided by the imaginary. What this means is that our dreams, reveries, and even our interpretations of direct sensory perceptions are suffused by an excessive, surplus semantic dimension, such that our experience always signifies more than its appearance. Through theurgy, the magician explores these diverse registers of overdetermination to discern the traces of the true will inscribed by the imaginary in the images of the imagination. Moving on to Coleridge's second category of the synthetic and creative imagination. This is the mental power of fashioning original representations that are not anticipated by past experiences. As a poet, Coleridge is especially interested in this ability, which he views as the psychological basis for artistic creativity. So the synthetic imagination is furthermore the theater of human freedom, as it permits the reprogramming of the historically given form of the imaginary through a species of feedback loop. This is possible due to the incompleteness of the imaginary. The transcendental imagination is not pure as Kant thought, but fractured and filled with contradictions because of its inscription through Oedipal trauma. Yet, dialectically, this negative aspect of the imaginary also at the same time imparts a positive quality to the imagination, ensuring its formal openness and lack of closure. On this basis, the creative imagination provides the means whereby we can formulate, know, and actively reflect upon our true will through the imagery of thought. The third of Coleridge's categories is the automatic imagination, related to memories, dreams, and the appearances within consciousness linked to instinctual responses. For Coleridge, the synthetic imagination is distinguished from the automatic because its representations lack originality. They merely passively repeat and re-represent past experiences, unlike the active quality of the creative imagination. Sigmund Freud thematizes such phenomena as expressions of the unconscious, which absorbs and repeats the impressions it receives from conscious experience. And in Kabbalistic symbolism, these same phenomena are described as being generated by the nefesh, the animal soul or automatic consciousness, which also corresponds to Yesod. Yesod's planetary attribution is to the moon. In the Rider-Waite deck, the tarot trump entitled The Moon features a dreamy nocturnal tableau of the lunar disk hovering over a pool of water. The pool is framed by twin towers, between which a path winds into the distance. This arrangement can be interpreted as a depiction of Yesod, where the pair of towers stands in for the pillars of the tree of life, through which the path of initiation leads upwards and inwards. Concerning these details, Paul Foster Case writes, quote, "The moon symbolizes the reflected light of subconsciousness. The pool below refers to the ninth of the Kabbalistic Sephiroth, Yesod, which is known as the sphere of the moon. It is the seat of the vital soul, manifested in man as the automatic consciousness, generally referred to in this book as subconsciousness." Unquote. The vital soul that Case names subconsciousness is the nefesh. The crucial hermeneutical detail is that the reflected light of nefesh derives from neshama, analogous to the way the light of the moon is reflected from the sun. Magically, this metaphor symbolizes how the imaginary is reflected into the imagination through the images emerging from the unconscious. Therefore, mysticism, the subject's inversion onto the imaginary in the quest for psychic integration, proceeds towards neshama, the wholeness of the psyche, by first exploring the psyche's division into conscious and unconscious, or ruach and nefesh. If this split within the psyche is overcome, neshama will manifest. It is through the imagination that this divide is mediated. By taming the animal soul, the turgid pool of water represented on the tarot trump of the moon is calmed and stilled, causing the silt of its accumulated impressions to settle, so that the light of the moon, that is also the light of the sun, can be clearly reflected. Neshama is then reflected into ruach through nefesh. However, it must always be kept in mind that therapy is the constructive alternative to psychosis, and that the magician must exercise ethical responsibility when journeying into the unconscious, lest they be the prey to madness and obsession. The nefesh hides the light of neshama, yet the unconscious is also the domain of the klipoth, the neurotic complexes that disrupt the free expression of the true will. The magician must pierce through and dissolve the shells of the klipoth that shroud and conceal the kernel of the hidden Gnostic light. Through its correspondence to the threefold Kabbalistic division of the soul, Coleridge's theory of the imagination illustrates how the image-making function of the psyche acts to link together and facilitate communication between neshama, ruach, and nefesh. It is therefore not surprising that working with the imagination is such a central and important part of magic. It is the gateway of initiation and the stage upon which the sacred symbols that mediate access to all the higher planes of attainment upon the tree of life tread the boards of the soul. Love is the law, love under will.